So, welcome to this Spark Talk number 5. We have a bit of sound in the background now. I thought we could start by just hearing a little bit from, if you can hear.
Not right now.
From track number 13 on from Steffen's recording. No. We'll try another one. Anyway, for you, those of you who didn't come to the exhibition, it's both sound and visual components, and which make up a whole. So, and this is the first time we are showing this kind of combination of sound and models and photography in this case. So I was wondering if, first of all, thank you all for coming, Hanieh and Daniel, Sebastian and Steffen, joining us. And I would like to introduce, if Sebastian and Steffen could introduce first the exhibition and what your thoughts were when you, like, how did this collaboration come about, so that we can understand the background and also understand how your interest in sound came into being.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the invitation, for first of all for the exhibition and also for this finishage talk. I'm representing our office. My partner Søren unfortunately couldn't be here this afternoon, but to start with the background of this exhibition. So actually we had the chance in Copenhagen last year to do an exhibition at a place from Let Dem Gå exhibition space, and we thought, because we have these buildings in the landscape, structures in the landscape in the western Jutland, near the west coast of Denmark, and we for a long time we thought it would be very interesting to work with this issue of sound of these specific structures. So when we had this chance to make this exhibition last year, we thought we should invite a sound artist. So we asked Steffen if he could help recording these structures. We didn't know exactly what would be the outcome, but just thought it was an interesting way to show our work, to add this dimension. So that's why we asked Steffen. So maybe Steffen, you can say a bit about what you actually did.
Yeah. I was working along the same lines on other projects before, but somehow this got, there was an extra element of linking one space to the other, like linking the actual works to the gallery space, which I thought was quite powerful. But in the first instance, it was just coming to these structures using guitar pickup microphones, vibration microphones, and just hearing this kind of concert unfolding at first on the steel structure, the bird watching tower at Tjäder. So we just got a lot of recordings, and it wasn't so much manipulating the sounds as it was just trying to categorize and gather things alongside each other, and then the work with actually testing out the space using vibrational speakers as a way to almost recreate the circumstances, of course, in a complete different way. but also in the two different spaces we've shown in, it's also been different circumstances with the audio, the way that the walls work and the windows and the window hanging process. So it's in a way been different works and standing out in different ways and sounding different in the street. But it is this very sort of strong principle to just link the actual buildings with the building that they're performed in.
Okay, thank you. So I'm wondering a little bit, what was your first interest in specifically? Was there anything specific about these two projects that you thought was why you were interested in recording the sound in relation to another building, or what? I mean, there must have been something triggering your interest.
Yeah. Is that a question to me? Or
yeah, to you mainly, yeah.
Yeah, so if I should start, we have these two actually rather different projects. If I should start with the bird watching tower, it's a steel structure, so it's a structure entirely made of steel, where every piece of steel is part of the overall structural system. So everything is actually either like load bearing or a tension bar, so you can feel the forces in every piece of the steel. So we actually for different reasons we like to call this these interventions we made in the landscape for instruments in the landscape, also because it's an instrument for actually watching and like making these scientific analysis and like following the birds, also from like professional scientists. So it's on one hand, it's really like an instrument in many ways, but it's also an object, a structure in the landscape relating to the flat horizontal landscape. But coming back to our interest of the sound issue, it's really like you could say it's literally like an instrument. You can hear the vibration of the steel because of the wind making small movements in the steel. Of course, if you would touch or like do your own intervention to like moving the tower or touching it, it would also have an impact on the sound. And especially with these contact microphones, we would get like a different kind of sound from what you would hear when just being in the landscape close to the tower. So it was this whole kind of you could say universe, or this aspect of our project that we somehow thought would have an interesting potential to unfold, without knowing exactly how it would end up with. The other building, or actually buildings, because it's a series of 3 different pump stations. They are made of bricks and concrete, and then we added these wooden structures. So it's a completely different kind of structure, but again, it's very much with vibration, because you have these like these pumps moving a lot of water, and so you have this whole vibration in the actually quite solid building, and then it's transforming up to the top where we added this wooden construction. So we really have these 2 different buildings where the sound in different ways has a quite an impact. And it's interesting because we also, while being at the site, Steffen and I went to another structure, a small bird hide, and also made of steel, but in a different kind of structure with plates, and it was completely dead. There was absolutely no sound. So it's not something you could do you could not take any building and do this. It's like quite specific to quite specific buildings. So that was a bit like the background.
Mm-hmm. So maybe Hanieh and Daniel, you could talk a little bit about how do you relate to the sound and recording of sound in buildings, because you have worked also with specific environments and locations where you're recording sound. And is there any similarity or any difference in recording, for example, urban sounds in relation to these kind of specifically tied to a single building or a single structure?
First of all, thank you for inviting us to this talk. And we have our practice called Studio Tjäder, and it's quite, we started last year. So we're still trying to understand and evolve what direction we're going. But I'm an architect, and Daniel is a musician, sound designer. And so we always had this discussion about how can we bridge or link connection between sound and space, because as architects we're so used to reading and looking at architecture with drawings and images, and it's always the still images or that someone else explains architecture and then the architecture is in the backdrop. And so we've done a few projects so far, but recently we did a sound inventory in an industrial area in Malmö. And it was a continuation of a cultural historic analysis that I was doing in Sofilunds industriområde. It's quite close to Spark. And so we discussed the atmosphere and the history and how the area developed from agriculture to the industrial site. And now the municipality of Malmö is, when we started our sound inventory, they were discussing about introducing a zone, a cultural sound zone in the area where you can usually you say you put a maximum volume and say that okay, above 85 decibel then it's noise and that's not allowed. But in this case they said that in the cultural sound zone you're allowed to make sound if it's culture that produces the sound and not the industry. So in a way it's an area that's slowly transforming, and it's slowly transforming with sound. So we wanted to start by doing a sound inventory of the area today. So what are the sounds and how can we create the vocabulary? Because as architects, at least my opinion is like we're not really trained to talk about sound. Sound something that just appears once the building is finished or the structure is finished. So how can we try to involve sound in an early stage? So that was kind of our starting point. And Daniel, you did the field recordings.
Yeah, and we talked about well, two things: make an inventory of the sounds. I mean, what specific sounds are we talking about? Which sounds are at play here? And so we wanted to know which they were, and maybe in the future also try and help form a kind of terminology for how to speak about these sounds. And so the field recordings themselves were made just by placing stereo microphones out in the open. So not specifically inside buildings, but rather out on the street, outside of buildings, just trying to capture the atmosphere of the sounds in the area. And so we did around 15 different recordings, and listened to them one by one, and then also listened to them together, playing at the same time. And that was interesting because then there was a kind of sound signature unfolding within the area. And so we actually ended up using those layered sounds with a tiny bit of manipulation, but mainly just to make the sounds a little bit more agreeable. Just taking them through some analog equipment to make them sound just a little slightly less harsh. Yeah, so that was it.
Yeah, but what we could see is like, because we were working on a much larger scale than these two buildings, it's a bit different, but when we try to talk about sounds landscape in a larger area, then each of the single recordings were not, it could be anywhere, but when you overlap them, then you start to almost get a audio visual experience of the industrial site, with the large streets, the low buildings, the lack of greenery, the car washes, the sound of the rhythmic industry in the area. So so that was for us kind of like a turning point, how to use like layering of sound to try and describe architecture.
Thank you. So what you're saying is that these sounds, would you agree that these are important for the identity of this area? And can you identify this area based on the sounds? Would that be a reasonable assumption?
Well, in a way, but I suppose you'd need more recordings to capture the area, because we made the recordings during midday, so around lunch, before and after. And if you'd go there by night, the sounds would be different. Less industry, maybe more music, like there are a couple of clubs there. So it would of course be different, and you need more time and more field recordings.
But at the same time, if we would do field recordings of another neighborhood with 15 field recordings, then we would probably get another sound and landscape when we overlap the sounds, I would say. But I think also it's a way of trying to approach sound and space, and try to find a way to work with it. Because when we see, especially like when we see renders of new neighborhoods and developments, there is so much live, and the renders are like so hopeful of the urban life that will just pop up. But I think that if we would just add the dimension of sound as well in the urban planning, what kind of sounds do we want to have here, then we would kind of progress a bit more.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to know, Steffen, perhaps, I mean, those who are architects, we have a certain way of experiencing architecture or space, urban spaces, but we are not very good at acknowledging the sound aspect unless there is a very specific type of acoustics, or like in church or something like that. But perhaps both Daniel and Steffen work with sound, and more on an everyday basis. Is there, do you have a different kind of approach when you approach a space, or are you more aware of the sound that it produces? Steffen, you could.
Yeah. I don't know. That would be much to say, maybe, but I think that in general, I try and find the sort of secret sounds around, and that also happens in street level or in electronics with electromagnetics, and just try and heighten the senses for this stuff and make them aware, so that maybe that the if you were, it's kind of a transparency thing, maybe, in a way, to make the invisible stuff visible, and also to make it as transparent as possible. Kind of like this crazy idea. A friend of mine said, "What if all buildings sort of look the same on the inside as on the outside?" And of course, some building styles put that more forward than others as a principle, but I'm interested in the place where the sort of inner life of a building also becomes apparent, in a way. Yeah.
And how is thinking about sound different from thinking about acoustics?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a different plane, of course, with how stuff is being thrown around, and low and high frequencies, and particularly that with the frequency stuff, maybe that's more in the sort of acoustic region also too. I mean, if there was some manipulation going on, it would be to emphasize low frequencies and make it sort of more sort of also dealing with the body in a different way. So I guess there are acoustic ways of also linking the building with one's body as a sort of visitor or participant or whatever.
For us, it has been really interesting to have this focus on sound and the actual sound of the structure. So you I think for good reason you have normally when you talk about acoustics in a building, or the sound aspect of a building. Now we're making an office building, and obviously it's important that you have the acoustic regulations, so you don't have too much noise, for instance, in a meeting room or in a big office space. So that's like a normal focus on sound. Max, you mentioned churches with a specific specific acoustic. But for us, with this investigation that Steffen has been doing, it has been very interesting that it's actually the sound of the building. So it's not necessarily what you would normally hear by visiting the building. Maybe you would feel it, but it's something different. And we Søren and I are very interested in this. Like when we develop our projects, we're very interested in really trying to find what is just necessary. Also, like not putting a lot of extra layers for this construction, but trying to make what is necessary for the structure that's also part of the actual space. Obviously, with a tower like this with no thermal insulation, so there's no kind of everything is for instance, it's a cold structure. So that's of course easier. We're also dealing with it in more like like you could say normal structures, like normal buildings with insulation and everything. But what I want to come up with is like this aspect of working with the visible part of the structure as a part of the spaces we create. I think that links very well to the fact that that's the sound of the building that we've been focusing on in this exhibition, because it has something to do with what is there, and trying to find it, and to kind of make it, as you also mentioned, Steffen, to make it accessible in a way. I think another project, it would be interesting to work with more like just the sound you would feel in a space like maybe you normally would do.
Yeah.
I think for these projects it was very interesting to have this. Yeah.
So would you say that so in this specific project you have sort of heightened the awareness of sound through these recordings, but it's not something, it's not the way you interact with it that is important, but it's the building itself that sort of generates those sounds, and you present them in a way that is more audible. But in general, how important is sound when you experience a building or an urban space? I mean, in relation to other sensory experiences, would you say, and perhaps also Hanieh and Daniel, like, what is your thoughts about the relationship between sound and your overall experience?
Well, it really depends on, of course, on the building and the program, so the function of the building. But it's interesting because often, if you have a well thought out acoustic, if you solve the acoustics in a kind of clever way, it's actually that you wouldn't notice it. So it's when it doesn't work that you notice it. Of course, if you have a specific program like a cathedral, or then it may be, or a concert hall, there are like specific needs. So normally it's like something that you shouldn't pay too much attention to. And then of course it's like also the visual part of it, how you deal with it. But I think just to summarize what I tried to point out before, it's for us, we're interested in the structure of the building itself, and for what we really like about Steffen's recordings is that it's actually the sound of the structures. So it's kind of emphasizing this focus, or adding another dimension to this focus that we already kind of try to have in these, especially in these two projects.
I would say that our senses are a bit tricky because we're so programmed to look with our eyes that, you know, in order to listen to the architecture, you need to close your eyes to turn off the audio senses. And I think that this exhibition is it's a good example of how to add an extra dimension, extract the sounds and place it in an exhibition space to kind of enforce the narrative of a structure in this case. But I think also for me, these two projects are a bit different, because with the pump station, there is this element of the history, the function of the building, how it was built and what the purpose was, and how the sound recordings show how the history of the building kind of transforms into the new structure. So there's this link between the old and the new, and the old function and then the new function, which is quite poetic. But it is it's tricky how strong our highs are and how it kind of takes away. But of course, it also depends on the project. Like if it's a new production, then the sound aspect, it's more about the regulations and the noise cancellations, whereas when you work with old buildings and transforming them, then maybe the sound and the history of the acoustics is an important part of the project. So I think it kind of depends on the program in a way.
Yeah, but do we pay enough attention to this, and how could we perhaps? I mean, you in your inventory you are placing you're focusing on the sounds, but how do you use them? I mean, in both cases, it would be interesting to see how do you go from a recording of kind of documentation to conceptualization of new sounds. How do you bring this layer into when you generate something new?
Is it to yeah? Sorry.
No, go.
Yeah, please. No, please.
I think the first thing is to like if you haven't listened, like you need to start to listen first in order to see what kind of noises or sounds they're existing, and you need to do it in a early stage, but you need to like actively listen, because we do a lot of analysis as architects with like site and context and history and the structure and materials, but I think that we need to add the extra element of sound as a separate sound inventory or sound recordings to add a new layer.
And as this is also in contrast to just measuring sound, because that's what normally happens. You measure the sound, but they don't really listen to them. It's just like a blip on a meter. So and if it's above, it's noise. If it's not, it's okay. This other than that, there's no distinction done between the sounds. So yeah, listening.
So it's important that we start. The first step is to listen, and then you can start to introduce this as a dimension in urban planning or in architectural design.
Yeah.
Is it something that you, Sebastian? Is it something that you have started to think more about in your design?
Well, I think it's a very interesting because it's, as we were talking about before, it's maybe not the first. Normally, it's not the first concern as an architect. So I think it's a very interesting kind of niche, like focus, because I mean, what I was talking about before with like acoustic regulations, etc. That's one thing, but that's maybe more like it's more like something you need to solve. I think where it becomes really interesting is, of course, if it really is a character of a space. Maybe if it's not about just of making the noise disappear, but maybe, I mean, it could be that you have a series of spaces, and maybe you have some like in between corridors or whatever, where you can accept a different sound, or like I don't know the English word, but like efterklang, like the how long the
reverberation.
Yeah, so I think that could be something interesting to consider if you could actually play with these kind of contrasts. So you have contrast. So you have maybe a space where it's very like pleasant to be in with no noise. If you're talking about a house, for instance, it could also be like a house for living. Like maybe you have a specific way, like entrance space or whatever, where you have a kind of harsh sound that gives you something, and then you have perhaps your dining room or living room where you can have have people talking without. I'm living in a private house now where we actually are dealing with. We have an issue here, so, and it's a listed house, so we're trying to to actually collaborate with an artist now but that's a completely different thing. It's just to say that I know how much you feel it when it's not working, but it's not necessary that you need all spaces in a house. Like could also be a bathroom. Maybe you have a special sound there where you can hear the water from the shower even more. I don't know. I think these kind of issues could be interesting to consider. And of course, with coming back to the two projects here and the tower now, which is of course in a way the case that it's the sound of the structure. It's not about the perception when visiting the tower, but it's not completely true, because you actually also feel it's a lot to do with the wind, and which is a very kind of characteristic of the area near the west coast in Denmark, where it's very windy, and of course it's not like you wouldn't feel this vibration or this sound. It's just kind of emphasized or made more like accessible by Steffen. So it's not you could not completely divide the fact of the sound of the building that has nothing to do with the experience of visiting the building or being in the building, and then so it has a kind of of double, of course.
Yeah, there is. I guess there is a way there that if we are exposed to certain type of sound conditions, for example, if we go back to the church or the cathedral, that it influences the way we enter the space, the way we use it, because when you enter a space where sound reverberates a lot, then you have a tendency to perhaps lower your voice, because you're relating to the sound that you're in, to the place you're in. Whereas if we have a space where the acoustics is very much taking care of the sound and making sure there's no echo or reverberation, then we perhaps take advantage of this by raising our voice. We can do that without bothering others. So it actually opens up a kind of vocabulary of different spaces where you can elaborate on different conditions. Hanieh, is that something, and Daniel, that you have thought about in your recordings, that different types of conditions, urban conditions, kind of open up for certain uses of the space based on the sound qualities?
Good question. I don't really. I think with the surveillance industriområde, the industrial area, it's such a specific purpose. There is a lot of it's always been industrial site ever since it started to develop from agriculture. So I think there is so much from the industrial heritage that's affecting what kind of functions you can have today, and the functions and the type of businesses kind of affect the sounds that you see in the area. So I think it's kind of working both ways. There are a lot of it's quite cheap to start business there with very little regulation. So then it kind of attracts businesses that make a lot of sound, and that kind of affects the soundscape in the area.
So it's more of there are other factors involved.
Yeah, I would say it's quite complex, and
I think a lot of the cultural actors in the area can exist and make sounds because they are actually working in the sonic shadows of the other bigger industries. And so, yeah, so I'm not sure how that relates, but
yeah, because there's been this ongoing discussion about should we change the in Swedish detaljplan or the detail plan? Should we allow, for example, housing? And we see that wherever housing is introduced, then it kind of affects the soundscapes, and restaurants and bars have to close because of complaints, and or the industry is affected. So in a way, the industry and the noise that the industry makes is kind of safeguarding for the culture to kind of coexist. And once housing is introduced in the area, then it will kind of start affecting what kind of sound could exist, or what kind of businesses that could be accepted by the housing. So in and we see that in many Swedish cities, for example, Stockholm, where a lot of clubs had to shut down because of housing or neighbors complaining, and we need to find ways to kind of allow sounds to coexist in a city or in an urban environment, so we don't get quiet cities. And I think this was the municipality's way of trying to test new ways. Like it's been tested in Berlin or in other cities, but never in Sweden. And so it's for us, it was interesting to do the inventory before the cultural sound zone, but also to try and follow the process. You know, what will happen? Is it just a legal term on paper, or will it actually affect what kind of activities that will kind of move into the area?
And when it comes to the domestic sphere, do you think that there could be a place, a bigger focus on the qualities of sound rather than just noise, both in terms of in residential areas and so on? Is there potential for sort of allowing more focus on sound rather than noise?
We had a lot of discussions about that. No, but it's like there's also in Malmö, close to Folkets Park, there's been so much discussions about how the laughter from children is noise. So the park, which is like the oldest public park in Malmö, they introduced like these bouncing pillows that you see for kids, and so the neighbors complained, and the city sent out noise meters, and they said that, oh, it's above the allowed noise limit, so you have to close down this children's area, or you have to move it. And for us, it's quite absurd that you can say that laughter or children's playing is noise, and we need to find both a vocabulary but also ways of measuring noise from noise, or sound from sound. Everything can't be sound, and that's part of living in a city. You have to allow sounds, but at this
Yeah, and talk about what kind of sounds do we want to have here. I mean, from a municipality perspective, and also from the citizens' perspective. What sounds do we find agreeable here? What sounds would we like to encourage? And I mean, even also, it's not only a question about regulation or non-regulation or acoustics versus sound, because I mean, also nice sounds sound better within a nice acoustic space. I mean, treated. So we can still keep that line of thought. It doesn't have to be totally just let all sounds just flow between the walls and reverberate. That sound is nice for a while, but then you start to get fatigue, ear fatigue from it. So it's about having multiple ways of talking about sound and sound versus noise, rather than just measuring and say, oh, this is noise because a meter shows that it's noise. It's a little one-eyed.
Yeah, exactly. But these are quite complex issues. But is there would you say that there is a vocabulary to talk about this now, or is it something you have to start from scratch?
There exists a little bit, I think, but it's in its infancy. But I mean, there is some talk of soundscapes in cities and some experiments done, but it's not part of the. I suppose you can talk more about that, but I don't think it's something you as architects or maybe even urban planners work on continuously.
No, I would say that we lack the vocabulary, or actually we lack the tools to talk about different types of sound. And I think that there are like different aspects of this culture sound zone, and maybe it's just politics, but I think it could be a way of trying to approach, because yes, we need to talk more about sounds in cities, but we also need to have ways of kind of forming sounds, and you do that by different regulations or different zones, and maybe that's a way of trying to approach how we talk about sounds. And like you said, what kind of sounds do we want in a city or in a neighborhood, for example? It's not enough to place a square in a site plan and say, here we want to have a square, but what kind of life do we want to be possible at this square, and how do we kind of enable it in a way?
Yeah. But I guess it's there are some aspects of what is private and public, and how things spill into each other from one zone to the next. That the public zone can generate sounds that spill into the private zone, and then it's a nuisance. But it can also go the other way, of course. But the public is annoyed by the private sound, or maybe at least that we between from one neighbor to the next have sort of difficult experience, like different ideas of what is sound and what is noise. Is that something? Yeah, Sebastian.
I was just, you probably all know this example of the sea, the ocean, and the highway is quite similar sound. And if you have a river, I've been camping once along a river, and it's a bit like the sound of a highway also near the sea, but because it's it's a natural thing and something that you find normally pleasant, the sea. It's somehow it's a nice sound to listen to, where the highway is a kind of something you don't want to. So I think that's quite interesting. Also, you were talking about the playground and the children, and somehow you could say it's mostly a positive a positive sound from the playground. Maybe now and then some children are crying, but in general it's a positive sound where if you have traffic, you were mentioning industry, it's something different. So I think that's interesting. If I don't know how you can I don't know if you could, if you have issues with sound from traffic or whatever, if you could kind of manipulate them to be a positive, how to the wind in a tree is like yeah.
Well, perhaps it has a lot to do with what we generally as humans experience when we hear the same sound or high sound over a long period of time. We can take, there's a threshold of how much sound at a certain volume that we can take before it starts to or at the same frequency, or at the same before our tolerance is over. For example, here in the States, I've been listening to the sounds of these two buildings for many days now, and I think I still enjoy it in many ways, because it's not the same frequency all the time. There is a variation from one track to the next and so on. Perhaps, Steffen, you know more about those things and how sound, when it starts to go from being an enjoyable repetition to becoming a nuisance.
Yeah. I mean, I often find myself in that situation, making really annoying soundtracks, also when I do video works or other things. So it's something I'm very familiar with. I think I have a very big interest in the place where it is partly a kind of awful torture chamber experience, but it's also there's something joyous to take from it. So that's kind of my niche, maybe also, that I sort of play on that doubleness as well, and some parts are really long and relentless and go on and on, so that when there is a shift or something, it can work stronger in that way. And I think this repetition is it also playing on this this kind of craziness, or that almost that the sound is coming from inside yourself in some occasions as well, is sort of part of it. So if I have tools to heighten those almost effects, I would call it, or sort of bodily relationship, then I think that's super interesting.
Do you think this could be applied also in sort of urban planning thinking, that you could advise people and the city planners how to create the sort of thresholds between what is acceptable and what is sort of just sonorically interesting?
Yeah, I think I see myself more of a spoiler than a fixer, but I think that if you, I mean, there was in Robert Morris wrote in the 60s or 70s this sort of fictional essay about this crazy man that lived in like a bunker thing in the desert, and he had this these sort of 2 round rooms with like a small corridor in between, where you would be faced with sort of cranial pressure from sound as you were walking through. So it also sort of double playing with this harshness. This could also be a way to direct people in the subway or something, but it's probably a bad idea. But it's also interesting to sort of try and come up with bad ideas in order to have functional ones maybe as well.
Yeah, but would you be interested in that kind of sound, like generating sound to sort of perhaps compensate or work with existing sound, and perhaps
yes,
allow
yes.
them to have a dialogue? Or
yeah, I think it's so interesting. And also one of the things about this project that made it extra interesting for me is that it's, I mean, it's almost dealing with real spaces. It's taken my work into at least a different location than before. So all this Mozart stuff in metros, I find it so interesting, and also other ways of doing it, and also sort of semi invisible ways of doing it as well. I think it's super fascinating or interesting part of this. Yeah.
Hanieh and Daniel, is that something you have thought about also, to play an active role in the type of generating the sort of urban soundscapes rather than just documenting it?
Well, that would be interesting, definitely, I think. And especially to delve into the questions of sound versus noise is very interesting. I mean, there's something interesting about noise, like man-made or machine-made noise as well, because quite recently there's been more and more experiments done with utilizing noise as a way to get people to relax and to focus. It's being used for people who have different kinds of letter combination diseases, and I've used it myself to focus when I'm in front of the computer. Just have, like, on a certain volume, have different types of noise. There are a couple of different noise types. Some are a bit more agreeable to humans, like pink noise or brown noise. They are less harsh in the higher frequencies. And that works. And it also works to mask out sounds coming from around you. So you have that in your headphones. And if you're sitting at a cafe, you don't, at a certain level, you don't hear the people around you. That noise becomes masked of the machine-made noise, like synthesized noise. So, and there's probably a lot to be had in developing that. And yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Great. Well, perhaps we could end there with that kind of possible creative output coming out in the future. Thank you all of you for joining this talk, and it was really interesting to delve into this audio dimension.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye. Thanks
Bye.
again.
Bye.
Tack allihop.